The blade pressed against Captain David Martinez's throat, its steel edge catching the moonlight that streamed through the cabin windows. His dark eyes remained steady, unblinking, even as the woman before him trembled with fury and desperation. Sandra Campbell's hair had come loose from its careful arrangement, cascading in dark waves around her shoulders, and her breathing came in short, sharp bursts that made the weapon in her hand quiver dangerously. "You think I'm some helpless creature you can trade like cargo," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle creaking of the ship. "You think because I was meant to be plain, meant to be forgettable, that I have no will of my own." David's calloused hands remained at his sides, though every instinct screamed at him to disarm her. Something in her green eyes, wild with pain and determination, held him motionless. This was not the woman he had expected when he agreed to Charles Mendoza's arrangement. This was not the unremarkable bride meant to seal a business transaction between two desperate men. "Sandra," he said quietly, her name rolling off his tongue like a prayer. "Put down the blade." She laughed, a sound sharp as breaking glass. "So you can hand me over to your crew? So you can collect your payment and sail away, leaving me to whatever fate awaits?" Her grip tightened on the knife's handle. "I'd rather die first." The ship rolled gently beneath them, and David felt the familiar pull of the sea, the endless horizon that had been his only constant for 15 years. But now, looking at this woman who had turned his world upside down in the space of 3 days, he wondered if he had been sailing toward this moment all along. Her beauty had struck him like lightning when she first stepped aboard his vessel. But it was her fire, her refusal to be broken, that had captured something deeper than desire. "I'm not going to hand you over to anyone," he said, and the truth of it surprised him. "Not anymore. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." The waves that had brought them to this moment stretched back across weeks of careful planning and desperate choices, to a time when both their fates seemed sealed by other people's decisions. 3 weeks earlier, Sandra Campbell had stood in her father's study, staring at the letter that would change her life forever. The parchment felt heavy in her hands, weighted with the authority of men who saw her as nothing more than a solution to their problems. Charles Mendoza's handwriting was precise, businesslike, as he outlined the arrangement that would see her married to a ship captain she had never met. "He expects a plain woman," her father Robert Edwards had said, not looking up from his ledger. "Someone who won't cause trouble, who'll be grateful for the match." His voice carried the weariness of a man who had watched his shipping business crumble piece by piece, leaving him with debts that stretched like chains around his family's future. Sandra had read the letter 3 times, each word burning itself into her memory. Captain David Martinez, master of the merchant vessel Serpent's Grace, sought a wife to accompany him on trading voyages. The arrangement would settle Robert's debts to Mendoza while providing the captain with companionship and someone to manage his household affairs in port, a practical transaction between practical men. "And what if I refuse?" Sandra had asked, though she already knew the answer. Robert's pen had stopped moving across the page. "Then we lose the house. Your mother loses her medicine. Your brother Edward loses his chance at university." He finally looked up, and she saw the defeat in his eyes. "There are no other options, Sandra. Mendoza has been patient, but his patience has limits." She had walked to the window, looking out at the garden her mother had tended before illness confined her to bed. The roses were blooming despite everything, their petals bright against the morning light. Sandra had always been told she was unremarkable, average in every way that mattered. Her father's business associates barely noticed her when she served tea during their meetings. Her few suitors had been half-hearted in their pursuit, easily discouraged by her lack of dowry. But standing there in the morning light, Sandra had felt something stir within her that had nothing to do with duty or resignation. She was tired of being invisible, tired of being considered a convenient solution to other people's problems. If she was going to be married off to a stranger, if she was going to leave everything she knew behind, she would at least face it on her own terms. "I'll need time to prepare," she had said finally. Robert had nodded, relief evident in his posture. "The ship sails in a fortnight. Mendoza will handle the arrangements." That night, Sandra had sat before her mirror and really looked at herself for the first time in years. Her reflection showed features she had been taught to consider ordinary, unremarkable. But as she studied her face in the candlelight, she began to see something else. Her eyes were not merely brown, but green with flecks of gold. Her hair, usually pulled back severely, fell in soft waves when released from its pins. Her figure, hidden beneath shapeless dresses chosen for practicality, had curves that might be considered appealing if properly displayed. For 2 weeks, she had prepared in secret. She visited the dressmaker under the pretense of needing travel clothes, but instead commissioned gowns that flattered her figure and brought out the color in her eyes. She studied her reflection, learning to carry herself with confidence instead of apologetic deference. She read everything she could find about sea voyages and trade routes, determined not to be the helpless burden everyone expected. The morning of her departure, her mother had taken her hand with fingers that trembled from weakness, but gripped with surprising strength. "Be careful, my dear," Marie Sanchez had whispered. "Men like Mendoza don't make arrangements out of kindness. There's always something more they want." Sandra had kissed her mother's forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender water and medicine. "I'll be careful, Mama, but I won't be invisible anymore." The journey to the port had taken most of the day, the carriage wheels grinding over rutted roads that spoke of a region in decline. Sandra had watched the countryside roll past, memorizing details she might never see again. When they finally reached the harbor, the salt air had hit her like a physical force, carrying with it the sounds and smells of a world she had only read about in books. Charles Mendoza had been waiting at the dock, his expensive clothes and carefully groomed appearance marking him as a man of means in a place where most struggled to survive. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made her immediately wary. His smile had been pleasant enough as he helped her from the carriage, but his eyes had assessed her with the calculating gaze of a man evaluating merchandise. "Miss Campbell," he had said, bowing slightly, "I trust your journey was comfortable. Captain Martinez is eager to make your acquaintance." She had followed him through the crowded dock, past merchant stalls and taverns that reeked of ale and unwashed bodies. Sailors called out to each other in languages she didn't recognize, their voices mixing with the cries of seabirds and the constant slap of waves against wooden hulls. The Serpent's Grace had stood out among the smaller fishing boats and coastal traders, her tall masts and sleek lines speaking of voyages to distant shores. "She's beautiful," Sandra had murmured, and Mendoza had looked pleased. "Captain Martinez has an eye for quality," he had replied, "in ships, in cargo, and now, it seems, in other matters as well." Something in his tone had made her look at him sharply, but his expression had remained pleasant and unreadable. They had climbed the gangplank together, her traveling dress rustling against the rope railings, and Sandra had felt the ship move beneath her feet for the first time. It was like being embraced by something alive, something that breathed with the rhythm of the sea. The crew had watched her with undisguised curiosity as Mendoza led her across the deck. She had kept her head high, meeting their stares with calm dignity, though her heart hammered against her ribs. These men looked nothing like the merchants and clerks she was accustomed to. They were weathered by sun and salt, their hands scarred by rope and blade, their eyes holding the kind of wariness that came from lives lived on the edge of danger. "Captain Martinez," Mendoza had called as they approached the stern cabin, "your bride has arrived." The door had opened, and Sandra's world had tilted on its axis. David Martinez was not what she had expected. She had imagined someone older, perhaps worn down by years of solitary voyaging, grateful for any companionship. Instead, she found herself looking at a man in his prime, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that showed no trace of gray, and eyes the color of storm clouds. His clothes were well-made but practical, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to command. But it was the way he looked at her that stole her breath. His eyes had widened slightly as they took in her appearance, and she had seen surprise, then something deeper and more dangerous flicker across his features. This was not the reaction of a man who had expected a plain, forgettable wife. "Miss Campbell," he had said, his voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of distant shores. "Welcome aboard the Serpent's Grace." She had curtsied, suddenly aware of how the green silk of her dress brought out her eyes, how the fitted bodice emphasized her figure. "Captain Martinez, Thank you for having me. Mendoza had watched their exchange with obvious satisfaction. I believe this arrangement will prove beneficial to all parties, he had said. The ceremony can be performed as soon as you are ready to sail. David's gaze had never left Sandra's face. Of course, though perhaps Miss Campbell would like to see her quarters first, get settled after her journey. That's very thoughtful, she had replied, though something in the captain's expression made her wonder if his consideration came from politeness or something else entirely. The cabin David showed her to was larger than she had expected, with a small porthole that looked out over the harbor and furnishings that spoke of comfort rather than mere functionality. A narrow bed was built into one wall, with storage compartments underneath, and a small table and chair occupied the center of the space. Her trunk had already been brought aboard and placed at the foot of the bed. I hope you'll be comfortable, David had said, standing in the doorway as if uncertain whether to enter. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask. Sandra had moved to the porthole, looking out at the bustling harbor. It's perfect, thank you. She had turned back to find him still watching her, and the intensity of his gaze made her pulse quicken. Captain, may I ask you something? Of course. What did Mr. Mendoza tell you about me? David had been quiet for a long moment, and she had seen him choosing his words carefully. He said you were a practical woman, well-educated but not given to romantic notions, someone who would appreciate the security this arrangement offers. And did he mention my appearance in office? Another pause, longer this time. He led me to believe you were unremarkable in that regard. Sandra had laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Yes, I imagine he did. And what do you think now that you've seen me? David had stepped into the cabin then, closing the door behind him. The space suddenly felt much smaller, filled with his presence and the tension that crackled between them. I think Charles Mendoza is either blind or a liar. The honesty in his voice had made her breath catch. She had expected many things from this arrangement, but not desire, not the kind of raw attraction that made the air between them feel charged with electricity. And which do you think it is? Given what I know of Mendoza, David had said, moving closer, I'd say he's neither blind nor particularly honest, which makes me wonder what game he's playing. Before Sandra could respond, voices on deck had interrupted them. David had moved to the door, listening, and she had seen his expression harden. We have visitors, he had said. Stay here. But Sandra had no intention of hiding in her cabin while important matters were discussed. She had waited a few minutes after David left, then slipped out onto the deck. The sun was setting, painting the harbor in shades of gold and crimson, and she could see a group of men boarding the ship. They wore the blue uniforms of the Royal Navy, their brass buttons gleaming in the fading light. Captain Martinez, the lead officer, was saying as Sandra found a position where she could listen without being seen. I am Commander Gary Murphy of His Majesty's Navy. I have orders to search your vessel. David's voice remained calm, but Sandra could hear the steel beneath it. On what grounds, Commander? Reports of smuggling, Captain. Contraband goods, possibly weapons. Murphy's smile was cold and official. I'm sure you understand our position. I understand that you have no legal authority to board my ship without proper documentation, David had replied. This is a merchant vessel engaged in legitimate trade. Commander Murphy had produced a folded paper from his coat. I have all the documentation I need, Captain. Now, will you cooperate, or shall I have my men conduct their search the hard way? Sandra had watched from her hiding place as David's crew gathered around their captain, their hands moving instinctively toward weapons. The tension on deck was palpable, like the moment before a storm breaks. She had seen David's jaw clench as he read the search warrant, and when he looked up, his eyes had found hers across the deck. For a heartbeat, their gazes had held, and she had seen something in his expression that made her blood run cold. This was not a routine search. This was a trap, and somehow she was part of it. The search had been thorough and invasive, with Murphy's men tearing through the ship's cargo hold and crew quarters with systematic efficiency. Sandra had been forced to remain in her cabin while they worked, listening to the sounds of her new world being torn apart. Through her porthole, she could see more naval vessels anchored in the harbor, their guns trained on the Serpent's Grace. When David finally returned to her cabin, his face was grim. They found what they were looking for, he had said without preamble. Which was? Weapons, hidden in cargo containers that were loaded yesterday after you arrived. His eyes had searched her face. Weapons I never agreed to carry. The implication had hit her like a physical blow. You think I'm involved in this? I think Charles Mendoza is more clever than I gave him credit for, David had replied, sinking into the chair across from her. He needed a way to get contraband aboard my ship without arousing suspicion. What better cover than a wedding party, a distraction that would keep me occupied while his men loaded their cargo? Sandra had felt the walls of the small cabin closing in around her. So I'm what, bait? A pretty distraction to keep you from noticing what was really happening? That's what I thought at first, David had admitted. But the more I consider it, the less sense it makes. If Mendoza wanted to use you as a distraction, he would have told me you were beautiful. He would have made sure I was completely focused on you from the moment you stepped aboard. Then why lie about my appearance? David had leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. Because he didn't want me to want you. He wanted this to be a business arrangement, nothing more. No complications, no emotional entanglements that might make me ask inconvenient questions. The pieces had begun to fall into place in Sandra's mind, creating a picture that made her stomach turn. He needed me to be forgettable so you wouldn't pay too much attention to me, but he also needed me to be here on the ship to provide legitimacy for the cargo transfer. Exactly. And now that the weapons have been discovered, I'm facing charges of smuggling and treason. My ship will be impounded, my crew imprisoned, or worse. David's voice had been steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped each other as if holding on to control by force of will. What about me? Sandra had asked quietly. You'll be questioned, probably released once they determine you had no knowledge of the plot. Your father's debts will still need to be paid, but that's no longer my concern. The casual dismissal in his voice had stung more than it should have. Of course, the arrangement is void now that you're facing arrest. David had looked up at her then, and she had seen something raw and desperate in his eyes. Sandra, I need you to understand something. When I agreed to Mendoza's proposal, I thought I was getting a convenient wife, someone to manage my affairs and provide companionship without complicating my life. I never expected... What? I never expected to want you the way I do. The words had hung between them like a confession. From the moment you stepped aboard this ship, you've been all I can think about. Your smile, your voice, the way you move, the intelligence in your eyes. I've been a fool, and now we're both paying the price for my blindness. Before Sandra could respond, shouts had erupted on deck. David had sprung to his feet and, moving to the porthole, and his curse had been low and vicious. They're bringing more men aboard. We're out of time. The next few hours had passed in a blur of activity and growing desperation. David's crew, led by his first mate Edward Powell, had worked frantically to prepare the ship for what everyone knew was an impossible escape. The harbor was surrounded by naval vessels, their cannons trained on any ship that might attempt to flee. But David had spent 15 years learning every trick of seamanship, every way to coax speed and agility from a sailing vessel, and he wasn't prepared to surrender without a fight. The tide turns in 2 hours, Edward had reported, his weathered face grim. If we're going to make a run for it, that's our best chance. Sandra had found herself pressed into service, helping to secure loose cargo and prepare the ship for what promised to be a harrowing journey. The crew treated her with a mixture of respect and protectiveness that surprised her, as if her presence aboard their captain's vessel made her one of them. She had worked alongside them, her fine dress soon stained with tar and salt spray, her carefully arranged hair coming loose in the harbor wind. You don't have to do this, David had said, finding her coiling rope near the mainmast. When the shooting starts, you should be below, in the safest part of the ship. Sandra had looked up at him, her hands never pausing in their work. This is my fault as much as yours. If Mendoza used me to trap you, then I bear some responsibility for what happens next. You're an innocent in this. You couldn't have known what he was planning. Maybe not, she had agreed, but I'm not innocent anymore, am I? The moment I stepped aboard this ship, I became part of your world, part of your crew. I won't hide below while you fight for all our lives." David had stared at her for a long moment, and she had seen something shift in his expression, a recognition of the woman she was becoming rather than the one she had been. "You're not what I expected," he had said quietly. "Neither are you." The sound of cannon fire from the harbor mouth had interrupted them, the deep boom rolling across the water like thunder. David had sprinted to the rail, pulling out a spyglass, and Sandra had seen his face pale. "They're firing on a merchant vessel trying to leave port. Warning shots, but the message is clear. No one leaves without permission." Edward Powell had appeared at his captain's side. "The men are ready, Captain, but we'll be sailing into the teeth of their guns." David had lowered the spyglass, his jaw set with determination. "Then we better make sure we're too fast for them to hit." He had turned to Sandra, his eyes intense. "Last chance to reconsider. Once we cast off, there's no going back." Sandra had thought of her father's house, her mother's garden, the safe, predictable life she was leaving behind. Then she had looked at the man before her, this pirate captain who had awakened something in her she hadn't known existed, and made her choice. "I'm with you, Captain. Whatever comes." The escape had been a masterpiece of seamanship and desperate courage. David had waited until full darkness, using the cover of night and his intimate knowledge of the harbor's currents, to slip past the outer ring of naval vessels. The Serpent's Grace had moved like her namesake, silent and deadly, her black sails nearly invisible against the star-filled sky. But their luck hadn't held. A patrol boat had spotted them just as they cleared the harbor mouth, and within minutes the night had erupted in cannon fire and shouted commands. David had pushed his ship to her limits, every sail set to catch the wind, every man working with the precision of a crew that had sailed together through countless dangers. Sandra had stood beside David at the wheel, her heart pounding as cannonballs whistled overhead and crashed into the sea around them. She had expected to be terrified, but instead she had felt alive in a way she never had before, every sense heightened by danger and possibility. "Hold steady," David had called to his crew as the ship heeled over in a sharp turn, spray washing across the deck. "We're faster than they are, but not by much." They had sailed through the night, the naval pursuit falling behind, as David used every trick he had learned in 15 years at sea. By dawn, they were alone on the open ocean, the coastline a thin line on the horizon behind them. But their escape had come at a cost. The ship had taken damage from the cannon fire, and their supplies were limited. Worse, they were now branded as criminals, unable to return to any port controlled by the Crown. "Where do we go now?" Sandra had asked as she and David stood at the bow, watching the sun rise over endless water. "There are places," David had replied. "Islands where the Navy doesn't venture. Ports where gold speaks louder than warrants. We can make a life there of sorts." "As pirates?" David had been quiet for a long moment. "I've spent my whole life trying to be respectable, trying to build something legitimate. But respectability is a luxury I can no longer afford." He had turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face. "The question is whether you can accept that life, whether you can accept me as I really am rather than what I pretended to be." Sandra had thought of the woman she had been just days ago, the dutiful daughter prepared to sacrifice herself for her family's debts. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone she had outgrown in the space of a few desperate days. "I think I'm still discovering who I really am, Captain. But I know I'd rather find out beside you than anywhere else." Their first weeks as fugitives had been a revelation for both of them. David had proven to be everything she had hoped for and more. A man of honor despite his circumstances, a leader who inspired fierce loyalty in his crew. And Sandra had discovered reserves of strength and courage she had never known she possessed. She learned to handle the ship's rigging, to tend wounds, to stand watch during the long nights at sea. More importantly, she had learned to trust David Martinez completely, and he had learned to trust her in return. Their marriage ceremony, performed by Edward Powell under a canopy of stars, had been simple and heartfelt, witnessed by a crew who had come to love them both. But it was the quiet moments between them, the conversations that lasted until dawn, the way David looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world, that had truly bound them together. They had taken their first prize 3 weeks after their escape, a Spanish treasure ship laden with silver from the New World. David had been reluctant to cross that final line, but his crew needed supplies, and the ship's captain had been transporting funds meant to finance the slave trade. The battle had been brief and decisive, with no lives lost on either side, and the captured silver had allowed them to outfit the Serpent's Grace properly for their new life. But success had brought its own dangers. Word of their activities had spread, and bounty hunters had begun to pursue them with increasing determination. Commander Gary Murphy, in particular, had made capturing David Martinez a personal crusade, following their trail across the Caribbean with single-minded obsession. It was Murphy who had finally cornered them at Tortuga, using information purchased from a treacherous merchant to anticipate their arrival. The battle had been fierce and costly, with several of David's crew wounded and the ship badly damaged. They had escaped, but barely, and Sandra had seen the toll it took on David to know that his choices had put good men in danger. The confrontation that had brought them to this moment, with Sandra holding a blade to David's throat, had begun with the arrival of a familiar face. Charles Mendoza had found them at a small island where they had stopped to make repairs, appearing on the beach as if conjured from Sandra's nightmares. "My dear Sandra," he had said, his smile as cold and calculating as she remembered. "You've led us quite a chase." David had stepped protectively in front of her, his hand on his sword hilt. "What do you want, Mendoza?" "What I've always wanted, Captain, a return on my investment." Mendoza had gestured to the men who emerged from the jungle behind him, armed and ready for trouble. "You see, when you disappeared with my cargo, you cost me a great deal of money. Money I had promised to certain parties who don't accept excuses." "Your cargo was weapons meant to arm rebels against the crown," David had replied. "I want no part of that trade. What you want is irrelevant now. You've become quite the notorious pirate, Captain Martinez. There's a substantial bounty on your head, and an even more substantial reward for anyone who can deliver you to Commander Murphy." Sandra had felt her blood run cold. "You're working with the Navy?" Mendoza had laughed, the sound devoid of warmth. "I'm working with whoever pays the best price, my dear, and right now that happens to be His Majesty's Navy. They want you both, but they're particularly interested in you, Sandra." "Why?" "Because you're the key to every other thing. Anything. Your father's debts, the weapons shipment, even Captain Martinez's transformation from respectable merchant to wanted criminal. You're the thread that connects all the pieces, and they believe you can lead them to other smuggling operations." David had drawn his sword then, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. "She knows nothing about other operations because there are no other operations. I'm not part of some larger conspiracy." "Perhaps not," Mendoza had agreed, "but convincing the authorities of that will require extensive questioning. The kind of questioning that leaves permanent marks, if you understand my meaning." The battle that followed had been brutal and chaotic. David's crew, though outnumbered, had fought with the desperation of men who knew capture meant death. Sandra had found herself with a pistol in her hands, firing at men who had come to drag her away to an unthinkable fate. She had killed for the first time that day, watching a man fall to her shot, and the memory still haunted her dreams. They had won, but at a terrible cost. 3 of David's crew lay dead, and Edward Powell had taken a wound that left him barely conscious. Worst of all, Mendoza had escaped, disappearing into the jungle with promises of return and revenge. That night, as they tended their wounded and prepared to sail again, Sandra had finally understood the full scope of what her presence aboard the Serpent's Grace had cost. Good men were dead because of her, because of the trap Mendoza had used her to spring. The weight of that knowledge had crushed down on her like a physical force, making it hard to breathe, hard to think of anything but the blood on her hands. "This has to end," she had told David as they stood together on the deck of their damaged ship. "I can't be the reason more people die." "You're not responsible for Mendoza's choices," David had replied, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the toll that constant danger was taking on him and his crew. "Aren't I? If I hadn't been so selfish, so determined to escape my old life, none of this would have happened. I should have stayed home, married some merchant's son, lived the quiet life I was meant for." David had taken her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. And then I never would have known you. I never would have discovered what it means to love someone so completely that their happiness matters more than my own life. The words had broken something inside Sandra, some last barrier she had built against the full realization of what they meant to each other. She had kissed him zen, desperately, as if she could pour all her love and fear and regret into that single moment of connection. But even as she held him, she had been planning her escape, her sacrifice, the way she could free him from the burden of protecting her, which had led to this moment. With cold steel against his throat and her heart breaking with every word she spoke. I won't let you destroy yourself for me, David. I won't let any more of your men die because Charles Mendoza wants to use me as bait. David's eyes never left her face, even with the blade pressed against his skin. What exactly do you think you're accomplishing here, love? I'm going to take one of the boats and row back to shore. I'm going to find Mendoza and surrender myself to him. Once he has me, he'll have no reason to pursue you anymore. You think he'll let me go out of the goodness of his heart? David's voice was gentle, patient, as if he were explaining something to a child. Sandra, Charles Mendoza doesn't make deals. He takes what he wants and destroys what he can't use. If you surrender to him, he'll torture you for information you don't have, then sell you to Murphy anyway. And he'll still come after me because dead pirates tell no tales. Then what do you suggest? Sandra's voice cracked with desperation. We can't keep running forever. Your crew is wounded, your ship is damaged, and every port in the Caribbean will be watching for us. How does this end, David? How do we find peace? David was quiet for a long moment, and Sandra could see him thinking, weighing options she couldn't imagine. When he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. We don't run anymore. We don't hide. We face Mendoza and Murphy and anyone else who wants to destroy us, and we make them understand that some things are our way worth fighting for. You're talking about a war you can't win. Maybe, but I'd rather die fighting beside you than live knowing I let fear drive us apart. David slowly raised one hand, his fingers brushing against her cheek. Sandra, from the moment you stepped aboard my ship, you've been the bravest person I know. You've faced every challenge, every danger, with more courage than most men I've sailed with. Don't let fear make you weak now. The blade trembled in Sandra's grip. I'm not brave, David. I'm terrified. Terrified of losing you. Terrified of being the reason you die. Terrified of what Mendoza will do to both of us if he catches us. Fear doesn't make you weak, David said softly. It makes you human. But what you do with that fear, how you choose to act despite it, that's what defines your courage. Sandra looked into his eyes, seeing the absolute faith he had in her, the love that had never wavered despite everything they had endured. Slowly, carefully, she lowered the knife, letting it fall to the cabin floor with a metallic clatter. So what do we do? David pulled her into his arms, holding her close enough that she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek. We do what we've always done, love. We face tomorrow together, whatever it brings. The plan David outlined over the next hour was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of continuing to run from their pursuers, they would turn and fight, but on ground of their own choosing. Using information gathered from captured documents and interrogated prisoners, David had identified the location of Murphy's base of operations, a fortified island where the commander coordinated his anti-piracy efforts. He thinks he's hunting us, David explained to his assembled crew. But we're going to turn the tables. We'll strike at his base, destroy his ships, and scatter his forces. Without Murphy's coordination, the other naval units will be operating blind. Edward Powell, pale but determined despite his wound, had nodded slowly. It's dangerous, Captain. We'll be attacking a fortified position with a damaged ship and a reduced crew. Everything we've done since leaving port has been dangerous, David had replied. But this time we're not running towards safety. We're fighting for the right to exist. The right to make our own choices about how we live and who we love. Sandra had listened to the discussion with growing amazement. These men, who could have abandoned David and sought pardons from the authorities, were instead choosing to follow him into what might be their final battle. They did it not for gold or glory, but out of loyalty to their captain and respect for the woman he had chosen to marry. The attack had come at dawn, with the Serpent's Grace emerging from the morning mist like a ghost ship. David's crew had worked through the night to repair their vessel and prepare their weapons, and their dedication showed in every precisely executed maneuver. They had caught Murphy's forces completely by surprise, sinking 2 patrol boats and setting fire to the harbor installations before the defenders could mount an effective response. But Murphy himself had proven to be a formidable opponent. As David's crew fought to complete their mission, the commander had led a boarding party onto the Serpent's Grace, turning the ship's deck into a battlefield. Sandra had found herself fighting beside David, a cutlass in her hands and fire in her heart, as they battled to protect everything they had built together. The turning point had come when Charles Mendoza appeared on deck, having allied himself with Murphy in a final attempt to claim his prize. He had cornered Sandra near the ship's wheel, a pistol trained on her heart, while David was engaged with Murphy's Marines. "It ends here, my dear," Mendoza had said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "You've caused me enough trouble. Time to pay the price." But Sandra was no longer the frightened woman who had left her father's house weeks ago. She was a pirate's wife, a fighter, a woman who had discovered her own strength in the crucible of danger and love. As Mendoza's finger tightened on the trigger, she had thrown herself sideways, drawing the knife David had given her and striking in one fluid motion. Mendoza's shot had gone wide, and Sandra's blade had found its mark. The man who had orchestrated so much pain and betrayal had fallen to the deck, his schemes dying with him. Around them, the battle had turned as David's crew, inspired by their captain's wife's courage, had fought with renewed determination. Commander Murphy, seeing his ally dead and his forces scattered, had made one final desperate attempt to salvage victory from defeat. He had challenged David to single combat, hoping to end the pirate captain's career with his own blade. The duel that followed had been a masterpiece of swordsmanship, 2 skilled fighters testing each other's limits while their crews watched in tense silence. In the end, it had been David's love for Sandra that had given him the edge he needed. As Murphy pressed his attack, seeking to overwhelm his opponent with sheer aggression, David had caught sight of Sandra watching from across the deck. The trust in her eyes, the absolute faith that he would prevail, had filled him with strength he hadn't known he possessed. Murphy's blade had found its mark, opening a gash across David's ribs, but the pirate captain had pressed forward despite the pain. His counterstrike had been perfect, his sword finding the gap in Murphy's guard and ending the fight with surgical precision. The naval commander had fallen to his knees, then pitched forward onto the blood-stained deck, his campaign of vengeance finished forever. The victory had been complete but costly. Several of David's crew lay wounded, and the Serpent's Grace herself bore new scars from the battle. But they had won something more valuable than gold or glory. They had won the right to choose their own destiny, free from the machinations of men like Mendoza and Murphy. As the sun set over the Caribbean, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sandra had stood beside David at the ship's rail. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility. They were still pirates, still fugitives from conventional society, but they were free to write their own story. "Do you ever regret it?" David had asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the stars appear in the darkening sky. "Leaving your old life behind, choosing this uncertain path?" Sandra had thought of her father's house, her mother's garden, the safe but suffocating existence she had abandoned. Then she had looked at the man beside her, this pirate captain, who had seen past the plain facade to the woman beneath, who had loved her enough to risk everything for her happiness. "Never," she had whispered, turning in his arms to face him fully. "I was dying in that old life, David, dying by inches without even knowing it. You didn't just save me from an unwanted marriage. You saved me from disappearing entirely, from becoming nothing more than a shadow of what I could be." David had kissed her then, soft and gentle under the Caribbean stars, and Sandra had tasted salt spray and freedom on his lips. Around them, the crew worked to repair their ship and tend their wounded, preparing for whatever adventures lay ahead. They were a family now, bound together by shared danger and mutual respect, and Sandra knew she had found something precious beyond measure. The woman who had boarded the Serpent's Grace weeks ago, expecting nothing more than a marriage of convenience, was gone forever. In her place stood Sandra Martinez, pirate captain's wife, fighter, survivor, a woman who had discovered her own strength in the crucible of love and danger. She had been transformed not by magic or wishful thinking, but by the simple act of choosing courage over fear, love over safety, adventure over the suffocating certainty of a life half-lived. As the ship sailed toward the horizon, carrying them toward whatever tomorrow might bring, Sandra knew that she had finally found her true self. She was no longer the plain woman her father had tried to marry off, no longer the unremarkable daughter who had served tea to disinterested suitors. She was a force of nature, a woman who could face any storm and emerge stronger for the experience. The pirate captain who had expected a plain, forgettable wife had instead found a partner worthy of his deepest love and respect. And the woman who had thought herself destined for invisibility had discovered that she was capable of lighting up the world with her courage and passion. Together, they had written a love story that would be remembered long after the last of their adventures had passed into legend, a testament to the transformative power of seeing and being seen, of loving and being loved completely.